Hello and welcome back to Encountering Jesus, our series for the seasons of Lent and Easter. And we are in week 4, and we're going to look at an encounter that Jesus has with a blind man in John 9. Over the last several weeks, we have been exploring people's encounters with Jesus. We've seen the first disciples and Nicodemus, and then last week we talked about the Samaritan woman at the well and how do all of these people respond to Jesus? That's kind of the question we've been asking as we've gone through this series. And so we're going to look at the blind man today and see how he responds to his encounter with Jesus. But before we dive into the passage of scripture, I wanted to ask you a question. If you were to rate yourself on how observant you are, from 1 being like completely oblivious to 5 being incredibly observant and noticing all the details, where would you fall in that spectrum? I know for myself, my answer to that question would be somewhat contextual. Well, what situation am I in, and what am I doing? Am I in the middle of a really good book? Because if I'm at the end of a book, my family knows me very well. Don't talk to me, don't interrupt me, because either 1, I'm not going to hear you, or 2, I'm going to be really grumpy about it. But I'm not very observant when I'm reading the end of a good book. Or perhaps we're not very observant whenever we're on our phones and we're scrolling through and reading the news. We can seem like we're maybe noticing things and respond to them. And I know I'm guilty of this, but we're not really being very observant. But there's other times when I'm very observant and I can notice all of the little intricate details. But what does it take for us to be observant in the first place? What does it take to notice all of those details? For me, being observant means that I am paying attention. I have my full undivided attention given to whatever it is I'm trying to observe. So if I am sitting out on the beach and I am just observing the landscape and watching the ocean and all the things, I'm going to pay attention to all of the details. The pattern of the waves coming up on the shore and going back out, and the shells that are tumbling over and how they are revealed as the water recedes, and the birds and they're swooping and diving after fish, and all of the different things that we see when we go to the beach. And we notice all of those minute details. To be observant takes setting our minds towards something and paying attention and being willing to pause maybe something else we're doing to observe those little details. So one of the things I love about Jesus is that he is both interruptible and he's also observant. He notices the unnoticeable. We saw that a little bit last week when we talked about the woman at the well and how he talked to her. But we're going to see that even more so this week as we look at the story with the blind man. So turn to John 9. We're going to look at this story. So the man in this story and is known as the man blind from birth. Often he's referred to as the man born blind. Just like the Samaritan woman, we don't get his name. He's just simply the blind man. So I'm going to call him the man throughout this whole thing. And so we meet Jesus and his disciples. It says, as he went along. So as Jesus and his disciples are going along, they encounter this blind man. We're told that he's been blind since birth, and that's an important detail because the view on blindness and many other ailments in the ancient world was that his parents or he himself had done something that had caused him to be blind. If you look at verse 2, his disciples ask a question of Jesus, leading to that exact conclusion. Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind? So that's a very common opinion for that time. The man must have been blind because somebody in his family did something wrong or he did something wrong. But Jesus kind of turns this whole conversation on his head. And he says, neither this man nor his parents sinned, but this happened so that the works of God might be displayed in him. So Jesus notices this man, he stops and has this conversation with his disciples and said, that's not the reason he's blind. The reason he's blind is so that God can be glorified in him. After saying this, we're told in verse 6, Jesus spit on the ground, made some mud with the saliva, and put it on the man's eyes. Well, let's just pause there for a second. Anybody else think that's kind of gross? Like, he spit in some mud and then rubs it in the guy's eyes. Like, I know the guy was blind and couldn't see what he was doing, but other people saw it. Obviously, they recorded that detail, and I've always thought it was kind of a gross detail. Like, Jesus, why did you need to spit in the dirt? Like, that's just kind of gross. But all of that aside, he tells the man to then go and wash in the pool of Siloam. And so the man did exactly what was asked of him. And he came home seeing, and his neighbors and those who had known him before and seen him begging, because that would have been what he would have had, his only career path would have been to beg on the side of the road. And they were like, hey, this looks like the same guy. And some people are like, no, that can't be that guy. But the guy's saying, no, it's me. It really is. And so in these first 9 verses, we see this man's initial response to Jesus. And it's obedience. Jesus tells him to go, and he does what Jesus says. Goes and washes his eyes, and he can see. And so really, he doesn't say anything until the very end of that section. And he says, no, I am me. It's me. And the people kept asking him, like, how in the world does this happen? And so he tells them what happened. So the other thing he says in this section, he recounts what happened, and he says, I did it, and I could see. And they ask him, where is Jesus? And he says, I don't know. And that's the extent of the conversation. And I love that we see his initial response is obedience. And then he's faithfully relaying what happened to others. So he doesn't really understand who Jesus is yet, other than this guy who made it possible for him to see. But we're about to hear a lot more about his response, because the Pharisees are about to get wind of this miracle, and they are not going to be happy. They do not like that Jesus is gaining in so much popularity. And the people who saw this miracle, and some of them brought the man to the Pharisees so that they can see, hey, this man was born blind, now he can see. And they're also going to be upset because Jesus performed this miracle on the Sabbath day. And they do not like that because they're saying it is a violation of the Sabbath. And so they bring this man before him and ask, now that he has received his sight, they say, like, what happened? And he once again recounts it. He made mud, he put it on my eyes, and I washed, and now I can see. And their response is, well, this man can't be from God because he doesn't keep the Sabbath. But other people are questioning, and they're saying, so the other religious leaders, as others ask, how can a sinner perform such signs? And so the Pharisees themselves are divided over what even happened. So their response is very much a divided response, and they're thrown a little bit into turmoil. But then the man responds, because they ask him again, well, what do you say about this guy? It was you whose eyes are opened. And he says, well, he's a prophet. And they still didn't believe, we're told. They start to then question, were you even blind in the first place? And so then the Pharisees bring this man's parents in, and the parents are a little bit nervous because they're being brought in before the religious leaders, and they ask them, was your son born blind? And how is it that he can see? And so their testimony is, well, we know he's our son. Yes, he was born blind, but now he can see, how he can see or who opened his eyes, we can't explain it to you, so you need to ask him. And we're told they're a little afraid of the Jewish leaders. This is in verse 22. Because they already had decided that anyone who acknowledged that Jesus was the Messiah would be put out of the synagogue. So the parents respond cautiously because they don't want to be put out of the synagogue. They don't want to be disfellowshipped from their people. And so then the Pharisees, after having this conversation with the man's parents, they bring the man back. This formerly blind man, they bring him back, and they're saying, you need to tell the truth. We know that this man is a sinner. And I love the man's response. So look at verse 25. He says, whether he is a sinner or not, I don't know. One thing I do know, I was blind, but now I see. And when they start to ask him the whole thing all over again, to go over all the details, he says, I've told you already, and you did not listen. Why do you want to hear it again? Do you want to become his disciples too? And then they get really upset because they're saying, you're following this guy, we follow Moses, and they get really upset. And he says, now this is remarkable. You don't know where he comes from, yet he opened my eyes. We know that God does not listen to sinners. He listens to the godly person who does his will. Nobody has ever heard of opening the eyes of a man born blind. If this man were not from God, he could do nothing. So at this point, they're really, really upset, and they threw him out after telling him, you were steeped in sin at birth. How dare you lecture us? And they throw him out of the synagogue. And so he's kind of cast out. But we see his response here, and it's this unfolding. First, he's very obedient, but not understanding like who Jesus is and what happened. But then we see an unfolding response as we go through this questioning from the Pharisees. He calls him a prophet. And then he goes on and calls him and says that he is from God. So he doesn't know all the details yet, but he is wanting to be faithful to what he's experienced in his encounter with Jesus, which was life-changing for him. But there's one more part of this story that I want us to look at. And it starts in verse 35. So Jesus hears that this man has been thrown out of the synagogue, and he goes and finds him. And he said, do you believe in the Son of Man? And the man responds, well, who is he, sir? Tell me so I can believe in him. And Jesus says, you have now seen him. In fact, he is the one speaking with you. And the man said, Lord, I believe. And he worshiped him. So we see the final response that this man has to Jesus is worship. He finds out Jesus' identity. First, he'd encountered him, was healed, completely transformed. And then he encounters Jesus again, finds out Jesus' identity, and his response is worship. Encountering Jesus should move us to worship, to want to fall to our knees, declare our love and our praises, and give thanks to him for what he has done for us. Take a moment and just think about, how have you encountered Jesus lately? And how have you been moved to worship him? We've seen a range of responses to Jesus in this story alone, but also over the last several weeks. And this is the first one that we've studied where the person is moved to worship. We have lots of people who've been moved to follow and to want to bring others along and dive in wholeheartedly. And those are all correct, good, wonderful responses. But I think adding this one to it gives us another layer of how do we respond to an encounter with Jesus? Well, we should respond wholeheartedly. We should respond invitationally. We should also respond by worshiping him, because Jesus is Lord. He is the King of Kings, and he is worthy of all of our worship. And when we think about this man and his just willingness to respond with worship when he finds out who Jesus is. So think about his experience. He went from an unnoticeable beggar, blind, unable to make a living for himself, sitting on the side of the road at the mercy of whatever anybody would throw his way, to being able to see, be completely restored, and be able to live a whole life. So no wonder he is moved to worship. Jesus noticed him when he was unnoticeable and transformed him. So as followers of Jesus, I think it's important for us to think about that. Who is it that God's calling us to notice in our midst, in our communities, in our schools, in our workplaces? Who are the people who are unnoticed, who are overlooked, who are marginalized, kind of pushed to the edges of society? And how can we notice them and show them the love of God? So as we close today, I want to challenge all of us to take some time and think about, one, how has God noticed you? How have you experienced Jesus noticing you and calling you forward? How does that move you to want to worship him? But then further, how can you participate in God's work in the world around us in the sense of noticing those who are not noticeable? And how can we do that better as a church, as small groups of Sunday school classes? How can we do that? An encounter with Jesus should completely transform us. And as we follow him, we should be continually moved to worship, and we should continually be moved to live our lives in his pattern, to notice those who are unnoticeable, and to participate with what God is doing in the world around us. So I hope you will join me again next week as we visit another encounter with Jesus in John's Gospel. And I'll see you then. Bye.